Hello and welcome once again to Cultural Caravan. I'm your host for this series of Cultural Caravan, Ed Werner, and we are studying Kenosha's history both in the city and in Kenosha County. Today we will be doing episode 9, the concluding episode of this series. We're going to cover the time 1926-43. A couple of interesting things of note happened back in the 1930s and 40s. Of course, in the 40s was World War II. But in the 30s, you may recall that Wisconsin's first orthopedic school was founded in Kenosha. It's located, or was located, right behind Washington Park Bowl. Also, in 1934, the last surviving member of the Civil War, Kenosha City Grays, was making his last dedication at Decoration Day for the departed soldiers. He passed away in 1936, and the history of the Civil War in Kenosha went with him. You may recall very vividly, for most of you, that in 1939, the famous yellow diesel engine, the Chicago and Northwestern famous 400, came flashing through Kenosha with her oscillating headlamp. I can remember very vividly being in the family car and waiting for the 400 to flash by at night. It was quite a sight. With that, let's look at episode 9.
Wisconsin's first orthopedic and open-air school was completed in 1929 and dedicated on November 5, 1929. It was located at 1808 41st Place near Washington Park here in Kenosha. The building was designed by the school district's building engineer, Art P. Kale. Kenosha's new orthopedic open-air school was situated at the rear of the Jefferson School grounds on a high bluff overlooking the beautiful Washington Park, where the children had ample space for play, air, and sunshine. The building was of Spanish mission architecture, 2 stories in height. The second story was of turret type, constructed of specially burned Kenosha brick with tile backing and an imperial ancient tapered tile roof. Steps had been eliminated in the approaches to the building, ramps rising gradually to the several entrances. Entering the main entrance from the south, you would find on the left the executive office and on the right the clinic for use of doctors, nurses, and attendants. At right angles to the entrance corridor runs the main corridor from east to west, dividing the building into 2 parts. The south portion was devoted to 4 classrooms, 2 for the orthopedic and 2 for the open-air work. Across the corridor were located, beginning at the west end, the dining room and a fully equipped kitchen with storerooms and refrigeration plant. The toilets were on either side of the ramp, leading to the sleeping and working rooms on the second floor, the hydrotherapy tank, the shower rooms, and the physiotherapy room with 2 alcoves for treatment. The second floor consisted of a large central room, which was used for play and for rest at certain periods. Cots and blankets were provided for all. 2 wings, one used for cots and the other as a workroom, opened from this main room and connected by stairs with ends of the main corridor. The windows of the building were of the pivot type, Vita glass being used in the 2 wings on the second floor. The building was beautifully lighted, heated with an automatically controlled oil-burning steam plant, and ventilated by the unit ventilating system. Floors were of rubber stone and desks especially constructed for the comfort of the children. The equipment of the physiotherapy room included Zolite lamps, ultraviolet lamps, bakers, massage and exercise tables, muscle testing table, parallel bars, graduated steps, stall bars, walking beams, head suspension, wands, dumbbells, finger wall board, Montessori fingerboards, posture mirror, and a specially equipped physiotherapy tank. The operating force consisted of 2 physiotherapists, 4 academic teachers, a matron, assistant matron, and a custodian. The capacity of the building in 1929 was 50 orthopedic and 50 open-air cases, with provision for the construction of 2 wings that would double the capacity of the building. Dinner was served to all at noon, while the open-air children had a lunch on arrival. Buses of the Wisconsin Gas and Electric Company carried the children to and from school. Treatments prescribed by the child's own physician were given daily by those especially trained for this work. In the academic department, the child received on an individual basis just so much of the regular course of instruction as his condition would enable him to handle safely and advantageously. The cost of the building and equipment was $96,091.44, and of the site, $4,071.49. An air of cheer and comfort was said to pervade the building, and helpfulness and thought for others were the characteristics of the work. This drawing is of the N.R. Allen and Sons tannery as it looked in the 1920s. The drawing depicts the company looking west. The street running past the gas tank and between the tannery building is Grand Avenue, or 52nd Street. At one time, the Allen Tannery was Kenosha's largest industry, and at this time, the 1920s, it had reached its peak. In the 1920s, the plant covered about 11.5 acres with a floor space, including the vat area, of 675,000 square feet. The various buildings were from 3 to 5 stories in height. There were 28 buildings in all, and with one exception, all were of mill construction, while throughout the sprinkler system had been established. The machinery was operated by electric power, which was manufactured by a steam plant of 20 boilers, developing 5,000 horsepower. The company employed on an average 1,000 men and utilized domestic packer hides, making heavy-soled leather and harness and saddlery leather. After operating as the Allen Tannery for a number of years, the plant was sold to the Union Tannery Company. In about 1928, the new owners began to dismantle and wreck the buildings, thus putting an end to one of Kenosha's large industries. Braving a drenching rain, 55 native sons of the state came to Kenosha County on September 29, 1927, to pay tribute to the pioneers of Wisconsin by setting the first of a series of markers on the Green Bay Trail. The first marker on the famous trail was placed on a spot 1.5 miles north of the Summers Town Hall, a site selected because it was near the place where the renowned Martin Tavern, a Midway house, once stood. It was there that the hardy pioneers halted to change teams of horses. The marker dedicated by that party of 55, assisted by Kenosha and county officials and representatives of the state, consists of a concrete shaft about 8 feet high, embedded with a bronze tablet on which is engraved Green Bay Road, Pioneer Road, Chicago to Green Bay, established by the federal government, 1832. The bronze markers on the concrete posts along the way in Kenosha County marked the first significant recognition of the merit of the highway as Wisconsin's pioneer trail. The Green Bay Road was of immense importance to the territory. It was at one time the only traveled road in Wisconsin. Eastern settlers pouring into prospective communities along the lakeshore used it entirely. It was impassable during bad weather, but it was the only route free from many backwoods difficulties. The trail was clearly defined, and its most regular users were mail carriers and pack trains carrying merchandise into the state. The mail was brought on pack horses once a month from Fort Dearborn, that is Chicago, to Fort Howard, Green Bay, a hazardous journey in the depths of winter and a difficult one at any time. In time, the conditions of the road and its importance as a main route for traffic into the Northwest was brought to the attention of the federal government at Washington. In 1832, the United States government authorized 2 post routes in Wisconsin, one from Green Bay to Prairie du Chien following the already laid out military road, and the other from Chicago to Green Bay. The Chicago to Green Bay route was surveyed and marked out in the spring of 1835. It followed the line of the ancient trail along the north branch of the Des Plaines River, then crossed to the south branch of the Root River, touched at Racine, ran northward to Milwaukee, thence along the west bank of the Milwaukee River, across the Sheboygan Flats, thence on to Manitowoc Rapids and to Green Bay. By 1838, it was possible for wagons to use the route as far north as Milwaukee, and in that year, Congress appropriated $15,000 for its improvement and sent United States engineers to lay it out. In the meantime, the first covered wagons with pioneer settlers from the east had come northward from Fort Dearborn, or Chicago, and one of these caravans stopped to settle at the mouth of the Pike River, now the site of the city of Kenosha. This was in 1835. Other recorded accounts of the first settlement of Kenosha record that the first settlers came to Kenosha from the north after landing in Milwaukee from lake schooners. In 1838, Lieutenant Stephen W. Kearny, later the military hero who captured New Mexico for the United States, made the first survey of the proposed route of the road. But it was not until 1839, when Lieutenant Thomas Jefferson Cram came out here, that any real improvements were started. In 1840, the road was cut out of the heavy timber from the Milwaukee River northward, but as none of the streams were bridged, it was still impassable for teams and wagons and could only be traversed by horseback. Nevertheless, the route was widely used, and it was an important factor in the settlement of southern Wisconsin communities, and those who landed by boat at the Milwaukee Harbor used it to make their way inland. Mary Davidson Bradford was the sixth child of Andrew Jackson Davidson and Carolyn Wagoner Davidson. She was born in Paris Township in Kenosha County on January 15, 1856. She attended her first school in District Number 5, Paris Township, which was built in 1851. The school was later known as Three Oaks. In 1868, she became a scholar in the public schools of Kenosha. At the age of 16, she taught her first school in District Number 2, a joint district of Paris in Kenosha County and Yorkville in Racine County. Her next venture in 1874-75 was in the third grade in the new building of the Kenosha Public School. Later, in 1876, she began teaching in a high school environment. Mary Davidson married on December 8, 1878, to William Ralvin Bradford of Kenosha. Mr. Bradford was a widower with a 7-year-old son. 3 years later, on March 20, 1881, Mr. Bradford died. In June of 1884, Mrs. Bradford was voted into the position of second assistant to the principal of the Kenosha High School. Later, she became a member of the faculty of Stevens Point State Teachers College and subsequently at the Stout Institute and the Whitewater Teachers College. She became the superintendent of the Kenosha Public Schools in 1910. 15 members of the congregation of St. John's Slovak Evangelical Lutheran Church purchased the old Colonel James H. Howe residence in the year of 1910. 23 years later, to the day, on November 13, 1933, a contract was awarded to Mr. Nels Nelson for the rebuilding of the old structure. The building had been erected before the Civil War and was at that time one of the large early residences in Kenosha. It is located on the north end of Milwaukee Avenue, or 8th Avenue. By a complete rebuilding and remodeling of this old brick residence, it was changed to fit the requirements of St. John's Slovak Evangelical Lutheran Church. The church building proper was extended to include a portion of the building that became the parsonage. The auditorium was to seat about 300 parishioners. The choir loft was constructed to accommodate 25 people. The rear of the building, basement and first floor, was combined for a gymnasium of 2 stories, about 45 feet square. The second floor above the gymnasium provided living rooms for the pastor and his family. The cost for the remodeling was about $20,000. Mr. Charles A. Leonard Sr. was the last surviving member of Kenosha's Park City Greys of 1861. This photograph was taken in the morning of May 30th, 1934, on the lawn of Mr. C.E. Dewey's home. Mr. Leonard was on his way to take part in Kenosha's Decoration Day service being held in Library Park. He was almost 96 years old at this time. Later in the day, he made a short speech at the service and performed the act of scattering flowers for the unknown dead. Mr. Leonard was born in Onondaga County, New York, on August 31st, 1838. He died in Kenosha in 1936 at the age of 98 years. The county store was built at Paris Corners by Mr. Paul Grew in the year of 1931 and was operated by him for many years. This photograph was taken in the summer of 1935. Paris Corners in the past had been known also as Tar Corners, a name given the locality sometime in the 1860s because of a tar and feather incident that took place there. This covered wagon and oxen model was made by Mr. Arthur Boness during the winter of 1936-37 when on a WPA project for the Kenosha County Historical Society. The completed model was installed on a board 15 inches wide by 60 inches long. Pioneering families left their homes in the east and spent many months moving west in a wagon such as shown in this photograph. The wagons were drawn at a snail's pace by oxen, bulls, mules, horses, and even at times by men. The trail was frequently muddy and often crossed creeks and streams. This blacksmith shop, the interior of which this photograph shows, was located on Main Street in Wilmot, diagonally across the street from the Hageman Hotel. It is unknown when this photograph was made, but the blacksmith shop was torn down sometime around 1932 or 1933. The man behind the anvil is Mr. William Faulkner, the owner of the shop. His assistant is his son, Fred Faulkner. This is James H. Bullimore. Near midnight on October 28, 1937, a marauder entered the Bullimore Brothers General Store, and while burglarizing the store, set off an alarm system designed by the two brothers. The alarm system summoned the two brothers, both over 70 years old, and they took up their posts, one at each door of the store. James pressed the light switch, and as the prowler fled from the east rear door of the building, he was given the command to halt by James Bullimore. Failure to obey the command brought a fatal blast from the double-barreled shotgun. James told the coroner, "He didn't halt, so I let him have it, and now he's dead." This is the Harbor and Simmons Company from 50th Street Bridge. This scene was taken from the 50th Street Bridge looking south, across the harbor, with the Simmons Company in the background. To the left, behind the fishing shanties, is the U.S. Coast Guard station, as rebuilt in 1934. Fishing tugs and fish shanties with the nets drying on the racks can also be seen. At the time this photograph was taken, in July of 1937, the commercial traffic in the harbor was mainly fishing tugs. The Racine Kenosha Rural Normal School was located at Union Grove. It had a carefully selected faculty of well-trained teachers, a first-class building furnished and equipped in the most modern fashion, and a comfortable dormitory to provide the very best living conditions at the lowest possible cost to the student. This size of school permitted close contact of the student with every member of the faculty. The school trained students to be teachers in the rural school system. After a period of teaching, the student could enter any state normal school in Wisconsin, receiving full credit for the work done at the rural normal school. Many of the graduates came to the rural schools of Kenosha County as teachers. This is the 400, the Chicago and Northwestern's first diesel engine. On May 30th, 1939, the Chicago and Northwestern's new light yellow-colored diesel locomotive pulling 10 cars passed through Kenosha on its maiden trip from Chicago to Milwaukee. Coming into Milwaukee, the train hit 95 miles per hour, and on the return trip to Chicago between Racine and Kenosha, it hit 98 miles per hour. To warn the public that the train was approaching at high speed, 2 lights were mounted on the front of the cab. The top one was a Mars signal light, which threw a flashing light with a swinging motion in the form of a figure 8. That light could be seen for 3 to 5 miles at night. The photograph shows the 400 approaching the Kenosha elevated tracks from the south at 75th Street on May 30th, 1939. The dam at Wilmot, across the Fox River, was always a popular fishing spot. This photograph, dated June 4th, 1939, records the popularity of the fishing spot. This aerial view of the Kenosha plant of the American Brass Company in 1939 gives a very clear understanding of the growth of the brass industry in Kenosha over the previous half-century. The Bell Clothing House was located on the corner of 6th Avenue and 56th Street in downtown Kenosha. The building is decorated because at the time of the photograph, August 1940, the American Legion's annual state convention was being held in Kenosha. The trolley bus making the turn from 6th Avenue west into 56th Street is a Wisconsin gas and electric bus. This is a view of the Kenosha station of the Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee Railroad, showing one of the new Electroliner trains just arriving from Milwaukee on March 8, 1941. The railroad was referred to as the North Shore by Kenoshans. This is the Charles H. Fenning building on the corner of 57th Street and 7th Avenue. 40 years before this photograph was taken in 1943, the Bar and Brister blacksmith shop was located here. On July 17, 1943, fire of an undetermined origin destroyed the old Allen Tannery building at 52nd Street and 6th Avenue. The 4-story brick building had been an industrial landmark in Kenosha. The structure, erected in 1891, was formerly the center of the nation's largest tanning industry, and at the turn of the century was Kenosha's largest factory. This completes our brief history of Kenosha. We hope you enjoyed this historical series and learned a wealth of historical information about your city. Kenosha has a past of which to be proud, and we were happy to highlight some of the interesting points along the way. Of course, many incidents of historical importance in the growth of the community were not covered in this series, but we hope enough were covered to spark your interest in Kenosha's past and in Kenosha's future. What we today consider the future of Kenosha, including that of the surrounding communities, will be shortly history to the next generation. Of equal importance to the next generation of Kenoshans is the responsibility that we have to ensure that the truly historical structures, papers, and photographs are preserved. The lighthouse restoration on Simmons Island is an example. Another example are the many family histories being written every year. As you probably observed during this series, history is a living story. You can help by joining a local historical society, gathering the family history, doing a genealogy study of your family, or by visiting historical sites and museums.
This concludes our study of Kenosha and Kenosha County. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did bringing it to you. And as we mentioned, and we try to make the point as we went along, history is really a living thing. History does go on. What we're doing today will be history tomorrow. And what is going on today? Well, there are some books being written at the present time. For example, here's Kenosha by Lois Repke Stein. Depicts pictorially Kenosha from 1835 to 1983. This excellent book has 2 features I really enjoy. One, the photographs practically jump out at you. You feel like you're standing right next to the photographer. The other important point I think you'll enjoy is the fact that it goes up to 1983. That means a lot of us can remember a lot of the photographs that are in here. A more recent addition to the history of Kenosha is the Louis Thier's book that has been recently published. This is a photographer's view of Kenosha in a time period from about the 1870s to about 1915. Some excellent photographs in this one too. Out in the county, I've come across an excellent book on the history of Twin Lakes. This is a well-written piece of work. If you're from Kenosha County and know Twin Lakes or lived in Twin Lakes, this book is a must for your library. But to me, the premier history book of Kenosha, before you even go to the library, is Carrie Cropley's Kenosha from Pioneer Village to Modern City, 1835 to 1935. This is really the Bible. This follows the narration pretty close of what we just went through in 9 episodes. I highly recommend this book for your library. In the future, Dr. Hosmatic is doing a work on the Kenosha Unified School System. That should be an excellent reference book. Mr. John Sullivan, aviation expert at Kenosha, is working on the history of aviation in Kenosha. As a matter of fact, did you know that the Kenosha Airport had 7 sites before its present location? And even myself, I'll have to admit, I too, getting to be an author. This is the rough manuscript of my work on the Kenosha Light Station. Pretty thick for just the lighthouse. And you, if you have a story to tell, you should think about writing it down. Even if it's never published, at least a copy of the manuscript should go down into the historical files at the Kenosha County Historical Society for researchers that are coming after us. But all in all, when you think back of history, I can't help but refer back to the 3rd grade. A lot of years ago now for me, but I remember those famous words after a semester of studying history and other related subjects. 2 famous words stand out in my memory. And I guess it's true of every 3rd grader. And here I sit, no more behind the desk, but on the desk, and I get the opportunity to say those 2 famous words. You do remember those 2 words, don't you? Class dismissed.